In the heart of New York City, amidst the glittering skyline of towering skyscrapers, The Rachel Myers Show, one of the most watched news programs in America, drew millions of viewers every week. Its host, Rachel Myers, was a household name, infamous for her razor-sharp wit, unrelenting style, and knack for cornering conservative figures on live television. Her guests often left the studio rattled, outmatched, and outmaneuvered. But tonight, the stage was set for something different, something unprecedented. Tonight, her opponent wasn't just another politician or pundit, it was Barron Trump. Barron had spent most of his life shrouded in the shadows of his family's larger-than-life legacy. The youngest son of former President Donald Trump, he'd grown up under the relentless gaze of the media but had always remained an enigma, quiet, reserved, and rarely stepping into the spotlight. Until now. At 18 years old, he'd agreed to his first major television interview, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Rachel saw this as her golden opportunity. She assumed Barron's youth and inexperience would make him an easy target, a chance to expose cracks in the Trump dynasty's armor. She envisioned a triumphant night where she'd dismantle him live on air, boosting her ratings and cementing her reputation. But as the minutes ticked by, Rachel would soon realize she'd underestimated her guest, and that miscalculation would turn the tables in a way she'd never see coming. The studio lights blazed as the show's iconic intro music faded out, signaling the start of another high-stakes showdown. Rachel Myers sat poised behind her sleek desk, her piercing green eyes scanning the room with the confidence of a seasoned predator. The audience, both in the studio and watching from home, leaned in, sensing the tension brewing. Across from her, Barron Trump took his seat. He was striking, tall and broad-shouldered, with jet-black hair neatly styled and a jawline that echoed his father's commanding presence. Dressed in a sharp navy suit with a crisp white shirt and a bold red tie, he exuded an air of quiet strength. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail as Rachel flashed her trademark smirk and launched her first salvo. "Barron," she began, her voice dripping with calculated sweetness, "let's be real. You've lived a life of privilege, everything handed to you on a silver platter. You've never faced real hardship, have you? So how can you possibly claim to understand the struggles of everyday Americans?" A hush fell over the studio. The question was a classic Rachel Myers move, designed to poke at insecurities, to frame her guest as out of touch and untested. The audience shifted in their seats, waiting for Barron to falter. The camera panned to his face, his sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly. For a moment, he said nothing, just tilted his head, took a slow, deep breath, and leaned into the microphone. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an undeniable edge. "I've learned about people's struggles not from a TV screen but from real life," he said, his tone steady and resolute. "My mother, Melania Trump, grew up in communist Yugoslavia. She built herself from nothing, with grit and determination. My father worked like a laborer to turn his vision into reality, earning every penny through sweat and sacrifice. My family's strength doesn't come from what we have. It comes from what we've fought for. You don't need to be born poor to understand people, Rachel. You just need to listen to them." The studio went still. Rachel blinked, caught off guard by the poise in his response. This wasn't the flustered teenager she'd expected. The audience murmured, a few nodding in quiet approval. But Rachel wasn't ready to back down. She adjusted her glasses, her lips curling into a tighter smile. She'd only just begun. Determined to regain control, Rachel flipped through the notes on her desk, her fingers tapping the papers with barely concealed eagerness. She'd prepared for this moment, hours spent with her team crafting questions to trip Barron up. She leaned forward, her voice taking on a condescending lilt as she fired her next shot. "Okay, Barron," she said, her smirk widening. "Let's talk about independence. Can someone like you really stand on their own 2 feet? Or will you always just be living in your family's shadow?" The question hung in the air like a taunt, designed to provoke insecurity and spark a defensive stumble. She glanced at the audience, expecting a ripple of gasps or knowing nods. Instead, Barron met her gaze head-on, unflinching. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he leaned closer to the mic, his voice now carrying a hint of steel. "You say I live in my family's shadow," he replied, his tone cool but cutting. "That's an interesting take. My parents raised me to stand on my own, to carve my own path. Love it or hate it, Rachel, I decide who I am, not anyone else. And the reason I'm here tonight? It's not because of some shadow. It's because I'm walking in my own light." A smattering of applause broke out from the audience, catching Rachel off guard. Her smirk faltered for a split second, but she quickly masked it with a forced chuckle. She could feel the momentum slipping through her fingers. Barron wasn't crumbling, he was rising. The studio lights seemed hotter now, the air thicker with tension. She shuffled her papers again, her mind racing. She still had one ace up her sleeve, a question so personal, so loaded that it had to land a blow. Or so she thought. Rachel straightened in her chair, her eyes gleaming with a mix of desperation and determination. She'd saved her knockout punch for last, a carefully crafted zinger she and her producers had rehearsed to perfection. She opened a folder on her desk, feigning a look of sympathy as she softened her voice, setting the stage for maximum impact. "Barron," she said, her tone syrupy with faux empathy, "you're a young guy, and I'm sure you want to prove yourself to the world. But let's be honest here. If you weren't the son of the former president, would you even be sitting in that chair right now?" The studio went dead silent. It was the kind of question that had broken lesser guests, a gut punch meant to strip away confidence and expose privilege. Rachel leaned back, crossing her arms, confident she'd finally landed a hit. The audience held its breath, eyes darting to Barron. For a heartbeat, he said nothing, just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as a sly grin spread across his face. "Funny you'd ask that, Rachel," he said, his voice low and deliberate, each word dripping with quiet power. "By that same logic, let me ask you something. If you didn't spend your career taking shots at my family, would you be sitting there right now?" The room erupted. A collective gasp swept through the audience, followed by a wave of stunned laughter and scattered cheers. Rachel's face froze, her smug facade cracking like glass. The camera zoomed in, catching the flicker of panic in her eyes before she could recover. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Barron had turned her own weapon against her with surgical precision. The crowd buzzed, phones lighting up as viewers at home flooded social media with reactions. "Rachel just got owned," one tweet read. "Barron Trump ended her career in one line," said another. Within seconds, 3 Barron burns. Rachel was trending worldwide. Rachel scrambled to regain her footing, her voice cracking as she tried to pivot. "Well, that's an interesting perspective," she stammered, forcing a weak smile. But the damage was done. The interview was no longer hers. It belonged to Barron. He sat back in his chair, calm and composed, as if he'd just played a winning hand in a high-stakes poker game. The audience could sense it too, a shift in the air, a new energy radiating from the young man who just turned the tables on one of TV's toughest interrogators. As the show rushed to its close, Rachel delivered a hasty outro, her usual bravado replaced by a strained politeness. "Thank you, Barron, for joining us," she said, avoiding his gaze. Barron simply nodded, rising from his seat with the same quiet confidence he'd carried all night. The cameras followed him as he exited the stage, leaving behind a stunned host and a studio still reeling from the exchange. The aftermath was seismic. Clips of the interview exploded online, racking up millions of views within hours. YouTube thumbnails popped up everywhere. Barron Trump shuts down Rachel Myers. Liberal host regrets messing with Trump's son. Comment sections overflowed with praise for Barron's wit, poise, and unflappable demeanor. "This kid's got ice in his veins," one viewer wrote. "He's the future," another declared. Even some of Rachel's loyal fans admitted she'd met her match. Meanwhile, Rachel Myers retreated to her dressing room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her team hovered anxiously, offering platitudes. It wasn't that bad, but she knew the truth. She'd tried to humiliate Barron Trump, to paint him as a spoiled kid riding his father's coattails. Instead, she'd handed him a megaphone, and he'd used it to announce his arrival to the world. Social media dubbed it the night Rachel fell, and late-night comedians were already workshopping jokes about her epic misstep. For Barron, the interview was more than a victory. It was a declaration. No longer just Donald Trump's son, he'd stepped out of the shadows and into his own spotlight. Insiders whispered that he'd spent months preparing, studying his family's battles with the press, honing his responses with the sharpness of a seasoned debater. That night, he'd proven he wasn't just a legacy, he was a contender. Days later, as the buzz continued to grow, Barron was spotted boarding a private jet, reportedly heading to Europe for a low-key retreat. Photos of him, windswept hair, dark sunglasses, and that same steely resolve only fueled the narrative. This was a young man ready to carve his own path. Back in New York, Rachel Myers issued a terse statement on her show, claiming she welcomed tough debates but offering no apology. Her ratings took a hit, and whispers of network pressure began to circulate. The world watched as Barron Trump transformed from a quiet figure into a phenomenon. Political analysts speculated about his future. Would he follow his father into the White House, build his own empire? Whatever came next, one thing was clear. Rachel Myers had tried to break him, but instead she'd unleashed a force no one could ignore. And in the end, it was she who walked away humbled, while Barron soared.